Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I have a very special guest today. Jamie's traveling, so somebody who knows a lot about this topic and a lot about American history has decided to guest star on our podcast. It is Matt, my husband. Do you want to say hi to everybody, Matt?
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this interesting milestone in our marriage. I've now become part of the podcast, so I'm not sure how I feel about this. I am going to push back a little bit. I am by no means an expert on Operation Paperclip, but I have been a history teacher for 30 years, and I have read about this program.
You know way more than we do, so let's get started. I'm going to give you the softball question first. What is Operation Paperclip?
Well, even the name has kind of a curious origin. We're not entirely sure the name itself was born out of a top secret code word.
Yeah, I was about to say, why Paperclip? Is that Operation Nazi or Operation Fuck Those Germans?
No, we think it may have been kind of an improvisational decision on the part of someone attached to the U.S. military at the end of the Second World War. Could have been OSS, which is the ancestor to the CIA. Could have been the U.S. Army. The origins of the program still have a lot of fog around the margins, but somebody took some dossiers, some information on POWs that were entering U.S. custody and attached a paperclip to a few of them that they felt like, well, perhaps.
Oh, so it is a literal paperclip.
Perhaps. Well, that's one rumor.
That is okay.
I mean, who knows if
that would make sense.
Who knows if there's any actual foundation?
I thought it was a metaphorical paperclip. But
no, and
it might have been a real one.
Listening to the podcast, it's not Microsoft's creepy office paperclip.
He selected. He went in and selected his favorite German.
Right. No. But that's apparently how it happened. And we don't even know if at the point of origin, we don't know if these were Germans who had some kind of authentic, legitimate connection to advanced weapons research, or were they just trying to say whatever they thought was necessary to get themselves formally surrendered to the Western Allies as opposed to being left behind for the Russians to scoop up.
So they could hypothetically have said, whatever. Oh, yeah, it could be me. I am an expert in liquid propellant rocketry.
Well, yeah, not only could that have happened, but we certainly know later, because the program runs into the 1960s, that there were definitely a few Germans who were repatriated under, I shouldn't say repatriated, they were expatriated under Operation Paperclip, who actually, it turned out, didn't really have any connection to scientific research at all. They were just looking to
They were like me.
save their own skins, yeah.
And me coming in and being like, okay, I guess I got to figure out some technology now. So it did run all the way up into the 60s, not just right after the war.
Right, which is one of the reasons why it's shrouded in mystery, because you can't easily figure out the different agencies that took part in the program. Mm-hmm. So at various times, the CIA was involved. Sometimes NATO was involved, the West German government. And when the final reckoning took place, and I shouldn't really say final because there's still information being declassified, but there had to be an interagency group that dug through all of the possible connections between NASA, the defense contractors, international companies like 3M, BASF. Mm-hmm. It proved to be this kind of ridiculous spaghetti tangle in which documents were classified through multiple layers of different restrictive controls. Mm-hmm. That meant even presidents like Ronald Reagan, when he tried to dig into reports that there were people working for the Atomic Energy Commission that had Department of Energy connections that had been Nazis. Even he didn't get straight answers back.
Wow. So even the president can't find out.
Yeah. No, it wasn't until 2005 that there was an attempt at a final report. But then during that report, the appendix to the report says, hey, FYI, there's another batch of documents that we will release in 2015. Then if I remember correctly, in 2015,
They
there was
delayed.
a postscript to the postscript that said, well, some of this might not come out until the 2030s.
Wow. So do you think we'll ever get a full view of Operation Paperclip?
I think there will always be interpretations of it that will have to have qualifiers that will have to say, well, we don't know if we know. We don't know what we don't know.
Mhm.
That, there will always be a kind of quantum around it.
And you said, so it wasn't just America that were scooping up these scientists, engineers. It was, I'm sure the Russians had thoughts, the British. Can you give sort of a scope?
Oh, yeah, I'd sort of contextualize it that way.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the mistakes that is sometimes made when we try to look back at 44 and 45 is this presentism. And that sounds like a made up word, but it's a real thing. It's when we project our own contemporary understanding of how history unfolded into a particular like fulcrum, a hinge moment in history. So obviously 45, 46 is when you start to get into the origins of the Cold War. But the notion that military leadership, the White House, even intelligence agencies, which are by design, intelligence agencies are supposed to be a little paranoid and distrustful. They're supposed to approach everything with a real magnifying glass of skepticism. The idea that we weren't going to be able to coexist with the Russians, that wasn't necessarily in people's consciousness in 45 and 46.
There was maybe a paranoia, I don't know, a slight concern, but they weren't saying the Russians are our friend at that point.
No, it's now ask Winston Churchill, he'd give you a different perspective.
Sure would.
Harry Truman was certainly much more distrustful of the Soviet relationship than FDR was. But in the popular imagination, the idea of a Cold War, that's not there in 45 and 46. So I think an awful lot of Paperclip is born out of the American realization during World War II that although we were an industrial powerhouse, and that ultimately was one of the key variables that helped to deliver victory, we had not developed these technologies that the Germans appeared to be so far advanced from everyone else in, whether it was the V1 and V2 rockets or just the level of integration they had achieved between German industry and the technological demands of the Second World War. And we were well aware that thankfully there were a few balls that the Germans dropped. Their radar was hideous. British radar was much better. It's possible that key physicists in their atomic weapons program intentionally messed up the math to make them think it would be much harder to get the uranium that they needed.
Oh, really?
Well, if you're a defender of Heisenberg, that's what you say, is that he intentionally goofed up the math.
Not that it was on purpose.
His critics say he just messed up the math. But anyway, there's a real sense that we can't be caught like this again, that we can't do the normal American thing, which is we don't have a large military in peacetime. We're very anxious about the existence of a standing army in peacetime. That goes back to the revolutionary experience. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that, if we're going to fight in a major conflict, we sort of improvise the military on the spot. I think the United States going into World War II was 38th or 39th in the world in terms of the size of its military. And there is a realization as early as 44 and 45 that no matter what the future holds with the Russians, we can't keep doing what we have been. And so scooping up these scientists before the Russians did the same thing, regardless of whether or not we were going to be able to get along with the Russians, was a priority.
Yeah. So basically, America hadn't been making these advances. Were they doing anything in terms of missiles and things during the war?
Yes, we definitely were.
I guess that is the benefit of having a dictator like Hitler, a very militarized society. We talked about in the first part about how the German army was funding this research that von Braun was doing in terms of what would eventually become the V2 missile.
Right. Although to my mind, the V-2 rocket was a terror weapon. It served no strategic purpose whatsoever. It was just all about
the amount of
making London, inhabit the state of terror years after the Blitz, right? And that's also, I guess, I hate to put it in such callous strategic terms, but that's also the downside to having a dictator, is that you could make an argument that the Germans devoted enormous resources to morally savage, hideous goals that, thankfully for the Allies, from the V2 to the Holocaust itself, didn't actually serve to win the Germans the war. It actually diverted resources that enabled the West, along with the Russians, who did all the heavy lifting in terms of bloodshed, which should never be forgotten, to bring the Third Reich to its knees.
Let's talk about what was known by the general public about Operation Paperclip, and how did people respond at the time?
People are aware that Germans are being relocated under this program before they know that it's Operation Paperclip.
So they wouldn't necessarily think it's a formal thing.
Right. And there are examples of, there's a real focus on the rocketry, but actually of the 1600, there's a huge number of paperclip scientists who are involved in chemistry. And some of them are in university posts. Some of them are in research settings attached to corporations. And some of them get outed in the 1950s through investigative journalism. The Boston Globe is involved in a really a famous example of that. And it's also the case, this is maybe a little bit redemptive, that the FBI is not thrilled that there are Nazis wandering around the United States. J. Edgar Hoover is on record as saying, I don't think this is a wise use of our current influence from the European landscape.
I can't believe that I'm agreeing with J. Edgar Hoover. God damn it.
Well, Hoover, there's not a lot to recommend about Hoover's worldview. He's animated by racial prejudice, and he sees leftist conspiracies everywhere he looks. But there is an important element that should get some emphasis, and I think a lot of Americans today are ignorant of this. In the 1930s, there was especially in the late 30s, a viable fascist movement in the United States. The infamous Detroit radio priest, Father Coughlin, his radio program was the most popular broadcast in the United States. And he was frequently saying things. In fact, I think I'm directly quoting here.
Oh God.
So please,
direct quote.
Please make note of this. This is not us speaking.
Quote.
This is
quote.
Yeah, Father Coughlin said, Jews in America will feel that what happened to them in Germany is nothing like what we hope to do to them here in the United States.
Oh God.
This was This was a period where when you bought a Ford automobile, you'd be handed, along with your warranty, a copy of a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, about Jewish conspiracies to take over the world that were operating through banks and other financial institutions. And there was an America First movement.
Hey, that sounds familiar.
It was championed by Charles Lindbergh, who I could see as a potential subject of ambivalent offenders.
Yeah, I thought about him. Speaking of him, there is a picture of him and Werner von Braun together.
All of which is to say, there's a real fear in the United States that, yes, a communist conspiracy from the far left may be percolating under our sheets, poised to dismantle the American experiment. But they also had a fear that what's a far right conspiracy, right?
So.
And so the idea of importing a bunch of Nazis to wander around American laboratories
and work, a lot of cases working closely together.
Yeah, it was not appealing, which is why the FBI and a lot of American investigative journalists, presidents would occasionally poke into this. Truman would poke into it. Eisenhower would poke into it.
Hey, tell me about those
Right.
Nazis we imported.
Right.
That's my 19. Well, I guess that would be 30, but 40s.
Well, yeah, that'd be 40s, 40s.
It was my
50s.
40s voice.
Yeah. Although on the other hand,
Can you do it? Can you do it, Truman? Give me your best, Truman.
Oh, I have the best impression of Harry Truman.
Yeah. You'd be better at it.
I don't know that I can do it, which is sad because I'm from Missouri, but I don't think I can do.
Do you have like a Missouri accent?
The way that you dissect those accents, as soon as you get from about Missouri on down, border states of the Gulf, is you have to take a word that has A in it. You got to take a word that's got the letters A and R right next to each other. So you take a word like war. Okay. So Harry Truman would talk about the Korean War.
Oh,
war. It's the Korean War, right? But if you ask LBJ about Vietnam, it's a war.
Right.
It's a war. That's how that works. But I don't know if I can do the full. But during the Cold War, American presidents would occasionally dig into Paperclip and they would be disturbed by what they found. But the program continued.
Can you tell some other examples besides, obviously, Werner von Braun is a big one, but do you have any other? You have some favorite. Are there any other big ones or ones that you would like to highlight besides Werner?
So I relied a lot in talking about this on a book I read a long time ago. It's not a scholarly work, but it's Annie Jacobson's Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America. And she does have some other writing that people have occasionally, I don't know, discarded as pulpy, in Area 51 and U.S. failure to disclose alleged encounters with UFOs. But she's also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And the Operation Paperclip book can be a little difficult to navigate at times because the program itself involves so many. It involves NASA, it involves the CIA, it involves NATO, it involves the West German government. It's a very difficult thing to describe, but in her book, stumble upon the revelation that engineers were a big part of it, but chemists were also a big part of it. And
let's make nervous for it.
Yeah. Now, oftentimes they would have this kind of interesting fog or smoke screen they would put up where they'd talk about it as space medicine or aviation research.
I don't like it.
And these involve barbaric experiments involving oxygen deprivation and putting human subjects through extremely cold temperatures.
I'm assuming this was camp.
Right.
Yeah.
Using anyone who was available in a striped prisoner uniform, be they Jewish, communist, gay, differently abled.
Romani.
Yeah. So this Hubertus Stroghold, the so-called father of space medicine, he comes to the U.S. and he's involved in researching a lot of the tools that are used to monitor heart rates, oxygen levels, there was a real anxiety in early space flight about can a human being under those kinds of conditions, especially the gravitational forces that are exerted on the body, the heart, the brain, the lungs during launch.
It's kind of mind blowing thinking now, where technology was, but we'd send people safely up to space
and brought them back.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was involved in a lot of the today we would call it biometric monitoring for astronauts, but he learned about a lot of the thresholds of what a human could tolerate through horrible experiments on human beings during the war. So he always jumps out at me. And I think the grand total, like this would be a quote from Jacobson's text. It seems that the legacy of Hitler's chemists is yet to be fully unveiled because so many of these German scientists were seen as assets to the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps nerve agent program and were thus wanted as participants in Operation Paperclip. Secret deals were made and the many documents pertaining to these arrangements were classified. President Clinton's, so now we're in the 1990s, President Clinton's interagency working group had access to 8 million pages of declassified documents, but millions more remain classified. For example, one of those scientists, Theodore Benzinger, when he died, and he was involved in similar kinds of experiments, the New York Times simply reported that this is a pretty good guy who developed a thermometer that you could use to measure somebody's temperature through their ear, right?
Good. We like
It's
that.
like, okay, good
We
job.
use that a lot.
Good job, Ted. What else did you do during the war? Well, like all these guys, and to my mind, we're recording this before we have episode 2 done for Wernher von Braun, but they knew, the idea that they didn't know what was happening under their feet it's ridiculous. They knew. And there was this kind of wink that took place where the United States knew what they had done. NASA knew what they had done. They knew what they had done. But out of expediency, eventually Cold War expediency. By the 50s, it's definitely the Cold War that's animating it. But when it first starts, I think it's just
to get ahead.
Right. It's just the United States realizing, like, I'll give you probably the most terrifying incident is in 1944, in the summer of 1944, it's finally possible for the United States and the British to take over the launch sites for the V2 rocket. And it's actually not something that strategically we probably should have focused on during the Normandy campaign. We probably should have focused on encircling the German army and trying to end the war before 1945. But come on, London is being terror bombed or rocketed, however you want to put it, every couple of hours. So let's take the launch sites. And when we get into the launch sites, we find this map, which I can send you. You can put it on the website if you want.
Yeah.
But I show it to my students in class and I go, does this look familiar to you? And they said, well, no, I don't recognize any of the words on this map. And I said, but look at the outline of it. Mm-hmm. And usually a few students will go, oh, that looks like Manhattan.
Oh, no.
And I'll say, yeah, no, do you see these circles around Manhattan? At the center of it in German, which I'll probably butcher.
Hey, your German's probably way better than mine.
And, well, we'll see. But in the center, it says Zilkpunkt, which is blast point. Mm-hmm. And the German plan for its atomic weapons program was to drop one right on Manhattan.
Wow.
Because they felt it would obviously not just destroy the seat of Western power. That was, Washington, sure, but, New York.
I think that is more terror than taking out. Yeah.
And they're condominiums today. But at the time, other than maybe Norfolk, that was, I should say Norfolk, that was where so much of our industrial output, so much of the Lend-Lease aid, so many of our troops moved in and out of New York Harbor. So my students will then ask me, well, but that was ridiculous because there was no way by 44 and 45 that the Germans were going to be able, a V2 rocket launched from northern France isn't going to be something you can target towards the Atlantic coast. Mm-hmm. And when we dug through those documents, we realized, no, what they were going to do, which was very viable, is just put a V2 inside a submarine and have the submarine come into New York Harbor.
Which, we did have.
Not only, but that became, submarine launched ballistic missiles was yet another technology that you could argue has these kind of foggy roots inside Operation Paperclip.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. Any other ones that you wanted to highlight?
I think von Braun, of course, is why we're here. He's the most famous. Arthur Rudolph was another Paperclip participant. And in some ways, he might be more important than von Braun because the Saturn V rocket was...
And that's the main one that took.
That's what brings us to the moon. That is using analog technology. So nothing digital, no computers. There's nothing. Today, we talk about this thing called fly-by-wire, where most modern jets they have manual controls, but you're never actually directly manipulating the surfaces of the aircraft that are exposed to the atmosphere. There's a computer that intervenes and makes adjustments for
Thank
you.
God.
And so the Saturn V, it had to achieve symmetrical thrust. Every little engine on there had to be producing essentially the same output, and it had to be able to move downrange. So when you launch a rocket, you don't just send it straight up. That's the world's, that's not going to work. It has to arc towards the atmosphere, and it has to follow a curve. And if the slightest malfunction takes place, if any one of those engines fails to deliver power symmetrically to the others, then the rocket either explodes or tumbles towards the earth, or worst case scenario, makes a 180-degree rotation, heads right back to where it was launched, and makes life really unpleasant for the people there. So that's mostly Arthur Rudolph. And you could make an argument that the V2 wouldn't have existed without him either. And he was also, more so than von Braun, I think, directly involved in running the concentration camp.
Oh, okay. So he was running Dora concentration camp, which is the camp and the underground plant, which was making those missiles.
And it caught up with him in the 1980s. He renounced his U.S. citizenship and went back to Germany
because of
these accusations had surfaced. And that was an interesting dynamic during Operation Paperclip too, is that occasionally the West Germans would want somebody back to prosecute, but most of the time they wanted Paperclip scientists and engineers and chemists back because they felt like it was a brain drain on their own attempt to recover in the 1950s and 60s.
That would make sense. I mean, you think of the scale of it. That is a lot. Once the Nazi regime is over, you're just left with a complete drain, not only in the scientists, but we'll talk about in part 2, where Werner's parents leave Germany. There's very little for people who survived the war to live on. Life is very different.
It is. And there was in time, one of the things that the 2005 congressional report did try to do, which is really ambitious, is they tried this. I'm not trying to be cute with my phrasing here, but they tried to reverse engineer the technological legacy of the Paperclip contributions. They tried to figure out, well, what exactly did we get out of this devil's bargain? And I'll just go ahead and quote again, because it's a little depressing. In 2005, in its final report to Congress, U.S. intelligence and the Nazis, the interagency working group determined that the notion that the U.S. military and CIA, employed only a few bad apples will not stand up to new documentation. That's the end of that quote. But then Jacobson goes on to say, in hindsight, wrote the interagency working group, the government's use of Nazis was a very bad idea. And now we're back to the quote, the direct quote from the report. There was no compelling reason to begin the post-war era with the assistance of some of those associated with the worst crimes of the war.
Jeez.
End quote. They were not able to find anything that we could not have developed on our own, although some of the chemical research that was done into things like sarin nerve gas, one of the reasons why the United States did not have pre-World War II research programs in those areas is because it was seen as a violation of international law.
Germany at that time was like, we'll do what we want.
Right. So it was almost as if the United States military leadership was saying, well, because we played by these rules, the Germans got ahead of us. And so now we're going to find someone who didn't play by the rules and use their research to kickstart our own chemical weapons.
Yeah, which pretty much negates your own sense of moral superiority. we didn't develop it, but we're importing people who did.
Exactly. So it gives you kind of a little bit of a filter when you look at yourself in the mirror, but not much of one.
Yeah. Well, it's depressing. Is there anything else that you think that the listener should know about Operation Paperclip before we close?
The only other thing I would say, and this is what I always tell my students, is, history is not the past. You can't study the past. You can't dissect history the way you dissect a frog. You can't get to it. It's not there. The frog runs away. History as a discipline is an exploration of the evidence we have of the past. And sometimes we don't know how to interpret the evidence, or sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what evidence we don't have.
Yeah.
So my advice to listeners would be, keep paying attention to this, because odds are for the next 20 or 30 years, things will keep spilling out, and we will learn more about this program.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to end it, that we don't have all the answers right now. The answers will continue to come to us. So if this is something you're interested in, continue to be on the lookout.
Absolutely.
As the cadence of declassification happens.
Right. Although you have to remember there too, for declassification, it doesn't happen automatically. Oftentimes you have to file a Freedom of Information Act requests to force the government's hand. So hopefully journalists and historians and scholars and ordinary podcasters will keep forcing this information.
Let's do it. Well, thank you, Matthew. That was wonderful. You were so good.
It's possible that you're biased.
I am biased, but I think the listeners are going to clamor for this to be a regular thing, because you bring such great insights. Who wants to listen to girls talking at brunch about history when they could listen to somebody with the insights that you have?
I would much rather just serve the mimosas and listen.
Okay. Well, you can serve the mimosas and join in every once in a while.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Well,
bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.